Thank you for the kind words, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I will talk today about the core of all of deep learning, that is learning representations of the world, representations that particularly aim to generalize to novel data that we might not have seen during training. A further goal is then to have these representations reflect semantic relations from reality, which is essentially learning a metric. And finally, we will discuss how to improve, how not to just improve the accuracy and power of such representations, but how to also make the models interpretable. That is, we want them to be understandable by the users that eventually will use them, so that they can make sense of them. A tiny bit of overview. I was asked to primarily speak about metric and representation learning. The interests, research interests of my group are evidently broader than that. We are having quite some work here on self-supervised learning, so how to utilize also training data when we're not having any labels for. A lot of work is on visual synthesis in a controllable fashion, so not to just like synthesize arbitrary nice-looking images, but how to eventually provide access to the semantics underneath so that we can carefully control the synthesis process and individual semantic attributes. Explainable AI, which I will partially talk about, and then a lot of applications such as behavior analysis, neuroscience, automotive, and the like. Now let's get into things. What's the core challenge, the key challenge of vision and of artificial intelligence on a broader perspective? I guess the key problem that perception as a whole, and with that then artificial intelligence, is facing is that perception is an inverse problem. That is, you have the outside world, and the brain is kind of trapped inside a box on top of your shoulders, with the only way of access to reality out there being through a tiny slit, which is our perception, which are our senses, eyes, so the sight, and the auditory perception, and so on. And through this tiny slit, our brain eventually needs to get evidence of what's out there, and then create a mental model that is a representation, which I will be talking about. A mental model or representation of the world, much in the sense of constructivism. Yeah, construct this representation or mental model of the outside world to make sense of what's out there, so that the brain can eventually ask the old Gestaltist question: why do things actually look the way they do? They present themselves to the brain through this tiny slit of perception. So, in a sense, I guess it's fair to say that we are all hallucinating all the time. That is, we try to imagine what's out there. It's only that when we agree on our hallucinations, then we call these hallucinations reality. Yeah, but at the outset, we are all trying to imagine what's out there and create an abstract representation of the outside world. And perception typically goes either way. We then make predictions about what the world actually is and how it will behave in the future, and then again observe how the world has changed over time. So this controlled hallucination perception process are intermingled. So with that, let's get to the grand goal of machine learning. And the question is really, what is the grand goal of machine learning? Is it learning to solve a task? Maybe a task as broad as classification or regression. As you know, like these are humongous tasks where a lot of different applications fall underneath: classification, regression, grouping, and so on. But I would object and say, like, this is much too small. Machine learning at the end of the day is not just about solving this particular task that we in that case need to know during training and then train a model to actually address this task. At the end of the day, machine learning should be all about learning a representation of the world without knowing the particular task that you then might be facing during test times. That is, you have the outside world, you have to suck it in, filter it in, come up with an abstract representation inside the machine learning approach, inside the neural network, and with that represent the essence. It's an abstraction, so you're representing the
updates.
And in addition to just representing what's out there, it's also highly important to capture the semantic interdependencies that are out there in reality. That is, we want to ideally capture even fine-grained relationships between different objects. Here, for instance, different trees, which ones are similar, which ones are dissimilar. So not just represent what's out there, but represent it in such a way that we can even capture those interdependencies of what's out there. And that eventually would be learning similarities, would be learning a metric. So now with that, let's look at representation learning and metric learning, what that actually means. The goal is to learn semantic relationships between data points. So you have here, for instance, a bunch of faces, and you want faces that are similar. You want these similarities to be expressed, to be captured by your representation. And data items, faces here, which are dissimilar, you want them to be further apart and capture these dissimilarities. So metric learning at the end of the day is learning representations that exhibit these similarity and dissimilarity relationships, these semantic relationships out in the real world. So that similar items in the representational space end up nearby and dissimilar ones far away. And the idea with that is that we eventually, that all representation learning, metric learning becomes a problem of learning a mapping function which maps from the original data space X here over into some representation space in such a way that semantic relationships between your original data points become metric distances in this representation space. For instance, Euclidean spaces here. So in that case, you have embedded all the data into Euclidean space so that the Euclidean distances reflect the semantic relationships out here, which evidently are not Euclidean distances. Yeah, but here they then eventually become Euclidean distances. It need not be Euclidean distances. There's a lot of metric learning utilizing Mahalanobis distances and many other distance functions. And traditionally, this mapping that we have here, this mapping function phi or here L, is typically learned using things like principal component analysis, linear discriminant analysis, there's convex optimization approaches, and many, many more. Yeah? So this is a well-established, long-existing field. And as you can tell, PCA being a linear technique, evidently a metric learning or representation learning that you do with that is limited. And that brings us to deep metric learning, DML, and deep representation learning, which is the core of everything that we're doing these days in neural networks, right? It's learning representations using a deep model. And the idea here is that you have, again, your data space, and metric learning plus an additional normalization that you always need to do is learning and mapping over to this embedding space so that you have here these relationships that you actually care about being expressed. And this mapping is then nothing but a neural network, so a bunch of layers here that take the input and transform it into embedding space in such a way, and that's the important thing, not an arbitrary representation. You learn this mapping in such a way that the semantic relationships that you want to capture become then, for instance, Euclidean distances in your target space, in your embedding space. Yeah, so it's reformulating this embedding function here by means of a deep learning approach. That sounds kind of a simple extension of an older problem, metric learning, turning it into, in the deep area, into deep metric learning. But there are a lot of sort of additional caveats that come with that and a lot of extra potential that this then eventually applies. So I first now want to briefly recap to get us all on the same page, the main directions that have been there in deep metric learning over the last couple of years, and then move out into open terrain of recent research that my group and others have been doing to improve on deep metric learning. So let's get on the same page and first talk about three essential points that deep metric learning has been sort of involved or has been doing research on. And the first is evidently the objective function. So here beforehand, we said that we need to learn this mapping here in such a way that we get these semantic distances captured. And the question is like, how do I tell my deep learning algorithm what the right function phi is? And as always, we need a loss function for that, or an objective function for that, which we can then minimize, and the minimization then gives us the right embedding, the right representation by means of backpropagation and the like. Now, metric learning has, to most part, actually used contrastive learning. So that is, we did not, I have this on a follow-up slide, just do classification tasks, but we actually wanted to follow a contrastive approach where you have an anchor, so 3 samples, an anchor sample, a positive sample, and these two here you want to be very similar, very nearby in your embedding space, and a negative sample, and that you want to be far away from the anchor. And then a contrastive objective with a margin typically. Margin gamma here is then expressed as computing a similarity based on your embedding. And here another, this negative similarities or distances, again based on the embedding, and you evidently want these here to be closer by than the negative samples to the anchor. So you want to push the negatives away and pull the positive samples nearby. And evidently these distances depend on the representation, depend on our embedding phi, and by optimizing this loss function, you will then find eventually the nice or the best possible representation. There's a lot of different similarity, a lot of different objective functions that have been proposed. These days, it's probably like multi-similarity loss, which is very prominent, where you're not just having a single positive, single negative, but where you're having a whole lot of those. So you're computing multiple similarities. Overall, like these ranking-based objectives have been pretty much like ruling over the last couple of years. Then there's proxy-based approaches, which typically get combined with a ranking objective beforehand. And the idea here is that you're not just taking the samples that I was mentioning beforehand, but that you're doing some kind of calibration, if you so want. So you take your anchor sample and you take some sample, a nearest neighbor here, and then you take other proxies which are other neighbors apart from this nearest neighbor PI that we used to have here, and you essentially, by means of this Gibbs distribution, this exponential distribution, then calibrate the distance that you have here by means of the other neighbors. So in essence, we're doing some kind of normalization based on a density estimation, local density estimation that we do here over the proxies. And this has been a very influential work, such as proxy NCA and the like. So a lot of literature on that, and influenced by earlier work, which is more than a decade old, the older NCA work. And then there's classification approaches, classification-based approaches, which still exist. And they're prominent if you have lots and lots of categories out there, when you're dealing with, for instance, millions of classes in a very fine-grained scenario, and then you have the very old like margin-based classification where you try to separate these classes from another, and by that means learn embedding. So that's been the objective functions. Then the very important domain, and this is also what I will tackle in this talk, are sampling-based approaches, because we all know since this work from like 4 years ago that sampling actually matters. And the idea is we are having, when we're building triplets, we're having three samples, right? So that means if you have n data points, you would need to potentially create n to the power 3 different triplets and train with them. Now that typically is not feasible anymore, and we want to have many training samples, but that's just too many triplets to effectively train on, and eventually you would forget what you started training with O to the n power 3. And that's why it's very important to sample the right triplets to then feed into your learning approach. So in essence, all sampling-based approaches try to figure out, for instance, the negatives to sample. So here we have the distribution of negative samples conditioned on positive and anchors. Negatives here coming from a different class. So you ask yourself, like, given such triplets, how should I sample my negative distribution? There's also positive sampling or strategies, and a lot of different sort of takes on how to do that, like whether you do it locally, just in a mini batch, whether you go for global mining approaches, and so on. But the point that I want to raise here is it's very important which data you feed into your learning approach, how you actually sample. And so far, this has been all or mostly heuristic-based approaches, which tell you what the sampling distribution would be. And I will show learning-based approaches that improve upon these more simpler heuristics that have been prominent beforehand. Okay, that's been sampling. And then a tiny last word, there's also ensemble methods. Ensemble methods such as bagging, boosting, and the like. We're not just having a single metric learning approach, but where you're having a whole bunch of them. You combine these approaches together to then get a stronger metric, much like it is the idea of bagging, boosting based approaches. So now here are the challenges that I would want to address in the talk today. The main challenges in metric representation learning I see in generalizing from limited training data to novel test data that we don't know about during training. But the catch here is that the distribution of test data might even be entirely different than that of training data. So that's like generalization on steroids, if you so want. It's actually transfer learning. So how can you transfer to and generalize to novel distributions during testing that you haven't seen during training? Second part, we'll briefly cover how we can come up with an optimal training policy, that is an optimal sampling process of which data to feed next into our learning algorithm, so that training becomes more effective than just having a random heuristic for sampling the data points. And then lastly, I will discuss how we can make all representation learning interpretable to the user. So how these models become more transparent and with that more trustworthy to users, so that important decisions, the way towards a solution with such an approach. So let's first concentrate on generalization. So far, most of metric learning has had the aim to learn a single metric for all of the data. So you're giving a large data set and you want to learn a single representation that reflects all the similarities in this data set. The problem with that is that the data distribution that we have is typically highly complex. Multimodal, there's different parts of your feature space, different parts of your data which have little to do with another. But inside these individual modes, there's a lot of structure, but these different modes are far away from another. And that means that learning a single representation for this highly complex multimodal data either overfits to individual modes and does not capture the other, or the other way around. But at the very least, it does not generalize well to novel data that it hasn't seen because of this complex distribution. So the idea that I will present here is explaining the individual substructures that we have in the data. So not learning from the start a single metric for all the data, a single representation for all the data, but we will concentrate on the individual substructures and then learn to build a metric from all of these individual models. So we will start off learning separate distance metrics on non-overlapping subsets of the data, and then eventually split, while we're doing learning these local metrics, we will also split the data and the representation at the same time. A data set is split into individual parts, and the metric, we're not having a single representation, not having a single metric, but a lot of individual ones. And then we will later on conquer, that is, bring these individual metrics together into one single metric again. And here's the essence of the approach. So you're starting with your data, you run it through your favorite neural network, and you get an embedding layer, a representation like everybody else does. Then we have a clustering-based approach, which tries to seek like substructures, these multimodal substructure of the data. All the data in individual subgroups that you're seeing here is pretty much similar to another, much more similar than between these different groups. And we split the data set into these individual groups, and then learn individual representations for each of these individual groups. Now, the important thing here is, and that's something that I should stress, the overall representation, by combining these individual representations together, the overall representation has the same dimensionality like what we had beforehand. It would not make sense if I would now have like k times as high of a dimensionality as beforehand. Then you would say, like, sure, your performance goes up. No, that's not what we're doing here. We are retaining the overall dimensionality. We're just partitioning the data, but nothing changes in terms of the overall dimensionality. And then we're having individual learners, individual metrics that we learn, with individual metric learning losses. All the ingredients are the same, so the same DML loss like we would have had here. It's only that it now works on part of the data and part of the representational space, so the individual ones are smaller. And then eventually we merge all of these here together into a single representation. So we take the loop and repeat this entire process m times to convergence. What you get out are individual learners that apparently have captured substructures, semantic concepts of the data, such as here, like if you go for Stanford online products, the gearbox or the handlebar, a crank, and so on in our data. And can evidently, since we have much less variability in each of these individual groups, capture them much better. And then when combining, the overall metric with that gets better. I guess it wouldn't make sense to now show you some tables with data. Yeah, sure, the numbers go up. If you just look at this publication there of ours, you can see the results and everything else. But we can offline or afterwards in the Q&A, I can also show you more results. Now with that, let's move on to a second take. And that is improving the generalization in a weird looking way, by aiming for shared features. And now let me explain why it might be looking weird from the start. So what we are aiming at is out-of-dataset generalization. So essentially transfer learning to novel test classes that you haven't seen beforehand. So you train on some classes, and during testing there come entire new classes that you don't know about during training. So this is your training set, and here's your test data. It's different. And the question is, how could we ever do that, right? I mean, the standard idea of machine learning is always having IID training test data. Yeah? They're independently drawn, but they're identically distributed. And here, they're not identically distributed anymore. And the question is, how can you learn ever? Can you learn anything from that? And the idea is, we call it DIVA, learning diverse features by means of feature sharing. And in essence, it gives you a more expressive representation of the data. There's no extra training data needed, and it can be combined with any standard loss that you're having. So let's buckle up and look how it works. So in this work, we observed that all metric learning that has been out there so far is mainly utilizing discriminative learning strategies. It seems to make sense from the outset, right? You have training data, here 2 training classes, and a discriminative approach then seeks to separate these 2 training classes from another. And this is nice if you have IID test data then, and then you would be separating the same classes as well. But if your test classes look different, have a different distribution, then maximizing on this class separation between the training classes might not help for your test classes. As you can see here, they would all fall into class 2. So if you're just class discriminative, as most of metric learning so far has been, it discards a lot of information that might be valuable for the novel data. So in essence, it discards here the shared information, which would be in that case shape information that you lose. If we, however, would learn shared characteristics as well, then you can see here that you would have a much higher opportunity, a much higher chance to actually separate the different test classes also from another. And this now might look weird from the outset, right? I mean, typically you have your training classes provided, and discriminative training is then the best thing that you can do. Just max out on your objective on the training data. But here the catch is, if your test data has different distribution, maxing out on this discriminative task is not the best thing that you can do, because it's a different task than you had during training. And in that case, you need to do something which, other than that, might have looked weird or not make sense, namely go for shared characteristics that deliberately don't separate the different training classes from another. But, and this is the important thing, which I will show later on in the experimentation, this explains the intra-class variability. And therefore, it also even helps the discriminative separation. Now, class discriminative features are typically learned using the contrastive learning that I showed beforehand. And that is, you want to make samples from the same class similar, and samples from different classes you want to make dissimilar. So standard contrastive learning using triplets with margin and so on. What we now suggested is something which might look crazy at the outset, and that is randomly sample 3 samples from different classes, and randomly make 2 samples from 2 different classes similar, and more dissimilar from a random third class. Now, at the outset, it might look crazy, like why should these 2 here be more similar than this one here? And we randomly sampled them, so it might also be the other way around. The idea is just, if I enforce this random similarity here and this random dissimilarity pair, then the algorithm will eventually, by doing that over a lot of triplets, will find some attributes that make some arbitrary 2 classes similar, so attributes which are shared across different classes, and nevertheless separate from other classes still. So we will find shared characteristics that are still to a certain extent discriminative. And we've applied the same thing for intra-class shared features, so essentially randomly sample 3 samples from the same class. And if you do something like that, and you start off here with your query and draw nearest neighbors, then utilizing class supervision, you would typically find only the discriminative features that you see here. However, if you go for the shared characteristics, you find attributes that might not be helpful for your particular data set beforehand, like color here, for instance, might not have been helpful in the data set because evidently the Jeeps here or the cars also have a certain variability in color, and different classes might also look different color. But this attribute then is helpful for different data that you have not seen during training. And this is what I promised beforehand, shared features also help the discriminative features. So in this plot here, you see how the shared feature dimensionality is increased. So the shared features become more and more powerful. They have a higher and higher dimensionality. And what we see is that at the same time, the performance of the class features here goes up. Now, how can that happen? Like, how can it happen that I increase shared features, which are not discriminative by the training setup, and still the discriminative features, these other features that are trained in a class discriminative fashion, improve in performance? And the answer you see here. The shared features explain the intra-class variability. And so the discriminative features don't need to take care of all this intra-class variability. So in essence, the discriminative features can now separate the different classes, different training classes from another. And all the variability within classes is now captured by means of the intra-class, these shared features. And as we all know, the variability is typically, the intra-class variability is typically what makes learning hard, and the shared features will take care of that. And I hope with that it makes sense, learning shared features even for a discriminative task. Now with that, let me move on to a second topic, and that is how to improve these sampling-based approaches that are key to metric learning. So I already said that there's a lot of data out there, and similarity learning, metric learning, typically is based on tuples or triplets, and that means you have n squared, or more typically n to the power 3 different tuples that you need to sample. This number is huge, and you typically need a heuristic so far, which is a heuristic distribution that you construct a priori, how to actually sample, for instance, your negative samples. Now, this distribution would be fixed There's curriculum approaches, but a curriculum is also fixed in the sense that you, before you learn, set up a strategy how this distribution will change over iterations. And for that reason, it's not adaptive to the state of the model that we're looking at. And what I would like to propose here is an approach where this tuple sampling distribution is updated while we're learning the metric using a teacher-learner scenario. So essentially, we're having a reinforcement learning approach where we have our learner, which tries to learn the metric, and the distribution, how we sample the data which we feed into the student, is updated by means of a teacher network. So here it is in action. This is the DML approach, your usual approach. You learn your representation by means of a neural network, and with that, learn your mapping here. So this is our student network. And the student network is trained on data that you shuffle into this network. And for that, we do have a teacher network. So rather than randomly sampling the data, we now have another neural network which samples the data that we will then feed into the student network. So in essence, this network is not just directly sampling the data, but it's adjusting the sampling distribution that you see here so that you can then randomly draw from this adjusted distribution. And the teacher network observes how the DML approach improves during training and then essentially feeds better data into the student. So it's a little bit like when I was learning to play tennis as a little kid. My tennis trainer always served me on the backhand, like when I was good at forehand, played me backhand and the other way around. And what I perceived to be nasty back in those days evidently was the sign of a good tennis trainer, observing like where the next round of training should be directed to. And the same thing we do here with the training distribution. Now, with that, let me move on. Let me skip this part here. We've been also doing quite a bit of work on self-supervised strategies for metric and representation learning, where you essentially try to deal with this scenario without actually having any labels and utilize transitivity between the data points that you've established to heal any conflicts in the data set. So we call this click-CNN, but in the interest of time, I want to skip this and rather move on to the last topic, which is the topic of interpretability or explainable models. And here I will first discuss an approach to come up with an invertible mapping of an arbitrary learned representation onto a semantic model that makes sense to you and I. Now, with that, let's understand the need for interpretable models. First of all, we know that deep models have gotten more and more performant. Their performance has tremendously increased over the last years, but the depth of these models and the complexity has equally increased to the point that now even the people that are designing these models have a hard time explaining what an individual representation actually means. And it might be nice that these models are now giving you great performance, great accuracy on a lot of tasks, but I guess that this is not sufficient in a lot of high-risk problems where you would want to understand why your car brakes, why your system makes a certain prediction about a patient, why, if you're in the judicial sciences or in law enforcement, why your system actually makes a certain prediction about a client. You cannot just say like guilty without actually giving any reasoning for that. And that brings us to the point of opening up this black box and making the decisions that the model has, or more precisely, the representations, these intermediate layers here, interpretable. And what we have put together is a invertible approach, meaning like here a model that establish a bijective mapping between this bunch of numbers, which have no meaning to you and I, and maps them over onto a representation which has semantic meaning, a representation where the individual components have meaning, have semantics that we can understand. And I said it's bijective, which also allows you to go backwards. So essentially, we can turn an arbitrary representation into one that we can make sense of We called it a disentangling invertible interpretation network. And the idea here is you can put it post hoc onto any approach that you have learned beforehand. So you don't need to change your network. You can use it more like a diagnostic system on top of a model that you might have trained beforehand, but you can also utilize it to improve the approach. So that's take one, why we need interpretive models. And the second, and this is more related to representation and metric learning, is that there's not just a single notion of similarity, for instance, of visual similarity. If you look at just the human figure, people can be similar or can appear similar in images based on their viewpoint, based on the posture that they're having. They can appear similar or dissimilar based on color, based on texture, or even iconological differences here, such as young and old, or rich and poor. And in the following, we'll now see how interpretive models can help us establishing several notions of similarity in parallel. So let's say you take an image here or some arbitrary input, feed that through a neural network, and then you're getting these latent representations. And the problem is, if you train these models end to end, these bunch of numbers here are not interpretable. We just have a representation without knowing what it means. And this invertible neural network that we've proposed maps this bunch of numbers over onto semantic concepts, which are disentangled from another and meaningful, such as whether this person here has glasses, the age, the gender, and so on. But because this representation, so in this way has been there beforehand, but because this model is now a bijective mapping, we can also go the other way around. So take an arbitrary, take such a semantic representation and turn it again into, or map it again back into the input domain, here in the domain of images, which allows you to also modify individual attributes to see and understand what the model has captured and what the model has failed to capture. If you alter the age attribute and nothing changes here, for instance, you know that your model is agnostic to age. So in essence, this kind of approach, you can squeeze into any arbitrary neural network. You pick an arbitrary layer between your encoder and decoder, or encoder and classifier layers. Pick an arbitrary layer. You take this latent representation and map it over onto an interpreter representation, and then map it back into the Z domain, and your original model won't notice what's going on, but you have in the middle an understanding of what these attributes actually mean. So Code and Everything is on our project page, and here's an example of how that works. Let's say we take some colored MNIST numbers, and we've now split up the feature space into a component which captures the digit, the 3 here that we, for instance, have, and the color of these digits that we're having. And you see that this is nicely unfolded. Here's a residual space, everything else that has not been captured, because evidently an image says more than these 2 attributes only do. And then you can see you can modify these individual factors, and you see how your representation jumps over in this space from one end to another, and what role the residual space, the things that you haven't captured, then play. Now, I already gave the keyword, things that you haven't captured, invariances of the model, and that's the last bit that I want to touch base on this talk. So the great thing, what gives neural networks the power, and at the same time their shortcoming, is that they learn abstract representations of the world. It is that they learn representations that exhibit a certain amount of invariances. If you, for instance, go for a classification network, it takes millions of input pixels, and eventually it just gives you a few bits saying that this is a snow leopard that we're looking at. So evidently, from the pixels to the final output, their information must be lost somewhere on this way. And it turns out each layer loses a tiny bit of information, and if you have a lot of layers, then eventually a lot of information will be lost. This gives you the invariance that you need, so that this thing will still be called a snow leopard if I change an individual pixel here or change the viewpoint slightly, recolor the image, meaning we have invariances established. But at the same time, it makes it very difficult if I have such a representation to, for instance, invert this process and then render based on this representation what the input is. And at the same time, this is what makes these networks susceptible to adversarial attacks, because everything that's not captured here, you can alter without your model even noticing. And the other way around, there are certain things that you can change here in the image, which will tremendously change your feature vector without the model having much of an idea of what's actually going on. So it turns out the further you go down into the depth of the network, in your discriminative direction, the more the invariances will increase, the more abstract the representation will be. And the harder, if you, for instance, go into the generative model here, model domain, the harder it will be to reconstruct your input modalities. So the more invariances you will have. And the question is now, how can we understand these invariances? How can we eventually recover those? And how can we then interpret what the model has learned and what it has not learned, meaning the invariances that it actually has established. So given such a representation that we're having here, we want to understand what Z captured, what is captured by Z and what is lost by Z. And so we learn a complete representation of our input domain by means of minimizing the reconstruction loss, having an encoder-decoder architecture here. And I hope you agree that you can minimize the loss as far as you want so that for this snow leopard, you will get a picture-perfect representation if you're just having enough parameters here. And this has other problems, but this here will be then a very capable representation. So evidently, this here captures much more information than this here, which is optimized to have a certain amount of invariances. And the question is, how can we move from Z, this space with a lot of invariances, over to this complete representation? How can we understand what Z is lacking, what is here in this Z bar encoding? And for that, we have proposed a conditional invertible neural network, which, conditioned on this representation that we want to understand, tries to recover all of the invariances so that we can come up with the original image representation. So essentially, we need to learn the distribution of everything else around this sample on the manifold. Yeah, so there's a lot of snow leopards that will have the same Z encoding, but in your original space, they will be different. And these invariances here capture everything that this model here has thrown out. And we want to learn the distribution of everything that looks identical to this model. And this is what the CINN does. So based on this conditional INN model, we can then take this perfect image and this reconstruction here and figure out all the invariances that the model has lost, so that we then can sample from the set of invariances and draw or here construct all images which look identical to this model. Yeah? So all of these here would be interchangeable to the encoder that we want to understand up here. And this model now gives us zillions of applications. Yeah, we can understand adversarial attacks. We can understand how network learning actually takes place. Yeah, what semantic attributes are captured when in the model. We can visualize a representation and also establish some semantic modifications. I want to just briefly pinpoint at a few of these abilities that such a model has. So let's say we have here a model and we take the conf5 layer out of, let's say, AlexNet, for instance. Here's an input image and feed it into our approach and sample here from the distribution of invariances, which encompass background, pose information, lighting, all these things that AlexNet would not care about when you would want to label this thing here as being a wolf. And then you train a decoder to reconstruct the images. And if you sample from this space, then you get all of the images which would for conf5 and AlexNet look identical. And you get this representation would say like, yeah, I mean, they're still looking all pretty much similar, right? And then I move to the right in AlexNet and get more and more abstract representations. This here is FC7 and this fully connected layer. Already you see that there's much more discrepancies than used to be there beforehand. Yeah? This was conf5, this is FC7. And if I then move to the last layer, a softmax layer, you see that all of these images here would in that layer look identical. So you see that the model has learned many more invariances. And with that, we can now interpret adversarial attacks. So you take an input image, labeled as wild dog, you pick a layer here in your model, and you learn the set of invariances. So all the images that would look identical to this model here, to get a sense like where an adversarial attack could attack the model. So we freeze this image here and then figure out like what other images, what invariances the model would have. And then we freeze this invariance. Now we take all the things that the model beforehand has thrown out. Yeah, I hope you got that. This is what the model here has thrown out. So when I want to turn this process around, I don't know what the model has thrown out. Now I capture how all the information that got lost when you wanted to encode this particular wild dog here. We freeze this, fix this invariance from our original image, and then we superimpose an adversarial attack. So we take this image, add here this randomly looking attack to the image, condition on that, and we get the attacked images by freezing again everything that the model has not captured in the original image. And when you do that for different layers, as you can see here, that's the input image. This is convolution layer, an FC layer, and so on. And you do that using a random image that you add. Evidently, your model is invariant with respect to the differences that you have superimposed, and these look all the same. But if you take here a carefully designed attack, you can suddenly see how Conf5 still is able to deal with that because it has less invariances, but how later layers now get fooled. And here you essentially can see why, because your the invariances here capture more and more of the overall variance of your data. Evidently, later layers capture less of the variance, and more ends up in the invariances, and that's why they're easier to attack. And this is kind of last thing that I would want to show. We can also with that establish a semantic analysis of network training. So let's say this is the network that we want to train with this representation. We can then map it over to some semantic concepts. In the case of MNIST, for instance, the digit that we are encoding, the foreground information, foreground color, the background color, and you can see when training starts here at the outset, background is dominating. So most of your feature is just capturing the background color of the image and to a certain point the foreground color, which obviously are useless when you want to discriminate different digits from another. You can see as training progresses how background eventually gets less and less prominent in your feature representation, and how the digit attribute becomes more important, and with that evidently also the accuracy increases, and with that your model then gets more and more powerful. Now with that, let me summarize. We've seen that it's very important to reduce the complexity when you're dealing with complicated domains and want to learn a representation or even a metric which exhibits the semantic relationships of the original data. And that dividing and then later conquering the representation, so not learning just a single metric representation, but several ones, significantly improves performance there, and also gets you closer to understanding actually what's in the data. We've seen that generalization is kind of the holy grail, and especially transfer learning, which is generalization on steroids, is actually the holy grail of what representation and metric learning tries to aim at. And we've seen that contrary to what is done beforehand, just maxing out on discriminative features is not the way that you would want to go, but that you also want to capture shared information such as intra-class or inter-class shared features. It's evident that sampling matters if you're learning from triplets of data, because you cannot harness all the triplets during training. And rather than going for a heuristic, as been done beforehand, I hope I could advocate that optimizing these sampling policies using a reinforcement learning approach so that they're carefully adjusted to the present stage of the metric learning approach makes the approach much more effective. And lastly, and this is really dear to my heart, we don't just want to ramp up accuracies of deep models, but at the end of the day, we want them to be also understandable to the user so that they trust the model and trust the decisions that the model entails. And for that, we've seen a conditional invertible neural network that maps an arbitrary network post hoc after training it onto semantics that makes sense for the user. And such a model allows also to explain the invariances that any neural network architecture has learned beforehand, to then explain why they can be fooled and how the training, for instance, progresses. The code for all of these models you can find on our group's website. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And I'd like to thank my incredible team who have made all of these things possible. So thanks, and I'm open for questions.